Started then. All right. Okay. Well, I want to begin by saying welcome from my home to the 10th annual Ohio Food Policy Summit. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that my home occupies the ancestral and contemporary territory of the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, the Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples, specifically on land that was ceded in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville and the forced removal of Indian tribes through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. I'm Jill Clark. I'm an associate professor at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs. And you can see some of who else is in the room. We've got folks from across the food system and and across Ohio. We've got folks from Fulton County in the Northwest, down to Athens County in the Southeast, or Athens County in the Southeast, from Adams County in the Southwest to Ashtabula in the Northeast. We've got folks from the islands of Hawaii and Ireland, and areas in between. We've also got in the room, while I'm kicking things off, this summit is a collaborative effort. And so I'm going to ask Amy to stop sharing your screen, and I will share mine here. And let's see. All right, so there you can see, the summit, these folks, this is who puts the summit on this year, and it's a collaborative effort. And these committee members are also in the room with us today. You can join us next year if you like. This is a great way to get engaged in the network. I also want to recognize Dawn Artiega. She has been working with us. She's with the Institute for Conservation Leadership. And if you're joining us tomorrow, you'll hear from her. We've spent a decade together, connecting connecting with each other to grow and develop a food system that supports Ohioans. And I spent some time looking at all the agendas from the last 10 summits. And there seemed to be three main themes. We were meeting together to advance the work of local food policy councils through capacity building workshops like the one we're going to have tomorrow on advocacy and lobbying to advance local agendas. But we also spend time advancing our own work together, establishing the network, building coalition building, learning from other states and other councils, working on our roadmap. And today, moving towards setting some policy priority areas. And we also spent some time doing a lot of co-learning on different policy issues of statewide importance. And I love to do research, so I took those agendas and I coded every single session we've ever had, and you can see what we've been up to for the last decade or so. And so you can see we've got health and chronic disease and healthy food access and incentives has been a big theme. So has rural and economic development and infrastructure and financing that infrastructure. That's also been a big theme. Farming in Ohio has been another theme, along with the Farm Bill, institutional purchasing. And it's, we've continued this conversation both topically here and kind of in these three buckets for quite some time. And we've actually started to weave a lot of the work together. So for instance, let's see, food system equity has been a theme, and now we're talking about, last year we spent time talking about equity in finance. And so, we spend time working together, and it's bringing us to today's agenda. So we're going to be spending some time setting our statewide, or beginning a conversation about policy areas and priorities. And some of you may remember, this is an image from our roadmap. And here we have our values, which really feed, feed the system. We have our goals together. We have our purpose. We've got objectives, and you probably saw that reflected in the previous slide of what we've been talking about. And then, of course, our vision for the food system that we hope to see for Ohio. Before we get to that, though, we're going to have some priming by Tom Philpott. I'm super excited. Not only is he the author of Perilous Bounty, and if you don't know already, you'll learn about all the ways that he's engaged in the food system. He has a wealth of experience and expertise. The other thing I want to do before we move on is to talk to you a little bit about our Ohio Food Hero this year. And the Ohio Food Hero Award is something that we give out to recognize Ohioans that, who are dedicated to strengthening collaboration and advancing the goals and the values of the network. A special thanks to Aidan Irish, who chaired the awards committee this year, and also to the other selection committee members. This year, there we go, stop sharing. This year, the award winner is Ashley Weingart. And if we were in person, I'd be handing this off to her. Instead, I'll be mailing it along. Ashley Weingart started Perfectly Imperfect Produce in 2016 as a response to the joint problems of food insecurity and food waste. And by rescuing produce that would otherwise be thrown out because of things like not being the right shape or size or color. Perfectly Imperfect Produce purchases produce from local farms and local wholesalers and packages them up in weekly boxes to be delivered to customers across Ohio. Each box is paired with a recipe to help customers know how to best prepare the produce. And in developing Perfectly Imperfect Produce, Ashley's, she's built strong relationships with food pantries and with hunger prevention organizations in Cleveland, and supports their work with weekly donations that are enabled from the subscribers. Her work demonstrates a strong commitment to the goals and values of our network, specifically increasing healthy food access, growing greater awareness through education, and developing infrastructure to support farms and public health. And so let's hear from Ashley. I'm gonna play you something that she prepared ahead of time. One moment. All right.
Thank you to the Ohio Food Policy Network for selecting me as the 2020 Ohio Food Hero. Wow, what an honor. When I started Perfectly Imperfect Produce here in Cleveland back in 2016, my mission was to reduce food waste and improve healthy food access for all. Since then, we have rescued more than 1 million pounds of produce, and we've donated over 100,000 pounds. We've come a long way, and we've since expanded across Ohio. We're excited about all the things to come as well. Thank you for supporting the work we're doing, and we will continue to work hard to ensure that no food goes to waste. Thank you.
Okay, so congratulations to Ashley. And just a couple of housekeeping notes that I wanted to share. We have a chat box which you can use to communicate with other summit goers. We've got a Q&A. The Q&A, use that for when we're engaged in our keynote. We're going to be also working with Mentimeter. Some of you got to try that out early on. We're going to be working with Mentimeter to engage later on when we're talking about our policy priority areas. And then I'm going to put in the chat a link to a Google Doc, which is running notes that are being taken, and please use that as a way to participate as well. But with that, thank you for being with us today. And I'd like to pass it off to Michelle Moskowitz-Brown, who is the chair of the network and also the executive director of Local Matters.
Thank you so much, Jill. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the summit. I'm Michelle Moskowitz-Brown, Executive Director at Local Matters, and proud to be the chair of the Ohio Food Policy Network. I spend my time with the Ohio Food Policy Network because it provides me an opportunity to think big about the future of food in Ohio. OFPN is about a shared agenda and our ability to put our whole state's needs above any one organization or area of expertise. Last year, OFPN adopted a steering committee structure for greater impact. We do remain a fully volunteer organization, but that hasn't stopped us from moving the work forward. We spent our time in the past year clarifying our purpose. We organized this summit with the steering committee and the planning committee. We've strengthened relationships, and we drafted the policy priority areas, which after your participation today will be further activated. You are OFPN, if you weren't sure about that, whether this is your first time at the summit or if you've been with this group for the past 10 years. And if you're interested in getting more involved, there'll be an opportunity to join committees after the summit, so please look out for that. And this network is all about public participation, so it's your network and it's your opportunity to help build a more equitable, resilient, accessible, healthful, and sustainable food system. As we consider the policies that we're going to need to get us there, I hope we'll continue to learn and grow from our past. I believe we must understand, as Jill shared with us earlier, the role that Indigenous people and then Black people had in settling and farming the land that we live on here in Ohio. In the United States, 96% of farms are owned by white people and 38% of farm laborers are white. This means that people of color make up about 4% of farm owners and about 62% of farm workers. This is just one example of disparity. As we reckon with systemic racism, we're also met by the compounding COVID crisis, in which food insecurity and diet-related disease are disproportionately affecting people of color and thus their quality of life and their lifespans. We can address these issues once we acknowledge them and we resolve to change. In the pre-conference materials and in the chat, you receive more information about OFPN, including the policy priority areas that we're going to engage with today and a food system racial equity assessment tool. OFPN will use this tool as we assess our priorities. And as you think about our path ahead, consider how we can dig into living our values and how you can help shape that path in the policy session that's going to follow our next speakers. I want to thank also the Planning Committee, the Steering Committee, the Institute for Conservation Leadership, the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability for their tireless and constructive work putting the summit together. And I also want to thank the OSU's Glenn College for hosting us. Please do reach out to me or another steering committee member. The best way to engage with us is through the Ohio FPN website, ohiofpn.org. If you're not on the listserv, please join the listserv today. And while you're there, explore the rest of our roadmap that Jill alluded to as well. And if there's anything that stands in your way from getting more involved with our network, please let us know so we can help address it. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Tom Philpott in conversation with Amy Vasquez.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome to Tom Philpott. Thank you, Michelle and Jill. My name is Amy Boddicker Vasquez, and I'm based in Columbus and currently serving as the policy chair for the Ohio Food Policy Network. And even though we're joining virtually together, I'm thrilled to have you all participating in our 10th annual summit, as Michelle said, whether it's your first or your 10th. And I'm thrilled to have as our keynote this year, my friend, Tom Philpott. Tom and I served together many years ago on the board of Chefs Collaborative, a national culinary organization that promotes and encourages the restaurant business to more sustainable directions. And so it's fun to reunite here today in this context and to celebrate his brand new book, which Jill held up earlier, and hopefully you can see all here today. Tom is the food and ag correspondent for Mother Jones, in addition to writing this book. At Mother Jones, he writes the Food for Thought blog online and contributes features and editorials to the print magazine. He has worked as a professional journalist for over 20 years, and he's currently based in North Carolina and Austin, Texas. A bit about Tom. In high school and college, he worked in restaurants, which led to, which maybe many of you also have done. And that led to writing restaurant reviews for the Austin Chronicle in the mid-1990s. And then he transitioned to financial journalism, working as a writer and an editor at The News and El Financiero in Mexico City in the late 1990s. And after a stint in New York City writing for Reuters, among others, Tom moved to North Carolina, where he co-founded in 2004 Maverick Farms, a small organic vegetable farm and center for sustainable food education. There, he combined his financial journalism experience with his commitment to politics, food, and agriculture to launch a blog called Bitter Greens Journal in January of 2005. And he's continued writing about food and agriculture ever since. His writings have been featured in national publications such as Grist and Newsweek, Orion, and the New York Times. In 2008, Food and Wine named him one of the 10 innovators who will continue to shape our culinary consciousness for the next 30 years. And in 2011, the Etnie Reader named him as one of 25 visionaries who are changing your world. This August, Tom's first book was published. It's called Perilous Bounty: The Looming Collapse of American Farming and How We Can Prevent It, which he and I will talk about a bit today and invite you to ask questions about as well. Corby Kummer, who's with The Atlantic, in his New York Times review of Tom's book, called Tom his go-to writer on farming and the environment. Perilous Bounty shows us both the ecological and economic problems with big ag, and it offers some solutions, including solutions we as members of the Ohio Food Policy Network might consider as we work to shape our own food system in the days of this summit and in the months and years to come. Some quotes from some other thought leaders in this space about the book before we go into our Q&A. Marion Nestle, author of Food Politics and Unsavory Truth, writes, in Perilous Bounty, Tom Philpott probes what's wrong with big agriculture, examining how it depletes California's water, poisons water in the Midwest, and ruins soil resources, and proposes ways to reconfigure the food system to better promote health and sustain the environment. This must-read book is deeply researched, compellingly written, and thoroughly inspiring. And Eric Schlosser, author of Fast Food Nation, writes, Tom Philpott knows how to farm and knows how to write. His warning in Perilous Bounty offers us a simple choice. We can change our centralized, industrialized, corporate-controlled system of food production or watch it collapse. And with that as the setup, I think we'll go in just to a quick Q&A between me and Tom, and then invite you all to put your questions for us in the Q&A. A bit of additional housekeeping before we get into that. We do have a feature in the Q&A that you can upvote somebody else's question rather than, if it's similar enough to your own, rather than typing it in, by giving it a thumbs up. And you can continue to use the chat to introduce one another and chat with one another. And remember, and I'm hoping one of my colleagues will put a link to this Google Doc in the chat a couple more times over the course of our hours together today. This is the running list of notes that we're taking. I believe it will also include a roster of all who are here. So it doesn't just have to be that you've introduced yourself in the chat. And it also will include links to Tom's work, both his personal website, Tom Philpott, with the double T at the end.com, his page at Mother Jones, where you can see more of his writings for that magazine, and a link to an independent book site where you can order his book. And so with that, welcome to you, Tom, and let's get started.
Thanks for having me, Amy. It's so good to see you, and so good to be here with this important event in Ohio.
Cool. So as your bio shares, you're interested in a lot about our food system and our food world, from science and ecology to economics and industry. You've experienced and written about small-scale solutions of regenerative agriculture, and you bring all of these aspects into the book, showcasing the multifaceted nature of our food system. In particular, though, in this book, you talk about the environmental impacts of industrial farming, particularly its impacts on soil and water. You say the ecology is supporting the massively productive enterprises in California, and the Corn Belt are unraveling. What made you draw our attention there in particular?
Yeah, so really, where I got the idea for the book was, so I've been covering these areas as a sort of national journalist on food and ag pretty much since I started way back in 2005, taking several trips out there, talked to a lot of folks. And it was during the California drought of 2011 to 2016, somewhere in that region. I was covering that drought and just looking at the way California agriculture, specifically in the Central Valley, was responding to the drought, and the way that essentially agriculture, in the absence of a snowpack in the Sierra Nevada mountains, which sort of drives agriculture in the Central Valley, there was this sort of drilling frenzy. And we're used to, drill baby drill for oil, but this was drill baby drill for water. There's this massive well drilling frenzy in the Central Valley. And it was so stark that it was causing the land to sink. And when I say sink, I mean by in some places a foot a year, causing all kinds of basically damage to infrastructure, really crucial infrastructure, highways, roads, water canals. So you get an accelerating kind of factor there. Literally the sucking down of water is causing the waste of water in the area by snarling up canals. And I was thinking about how this is the key source of fruits and vegetables in the United States. This is where, and I've got the numbers in my book, 80% of carrots and 75% of salad greens, and just these staggering numbers. This is where it comes from. And it was looking like it was in a state of long-term ecological decline. And I should also say, but for the people who live there, in normal times in the Central Valley, you've got water polluted by nitrates, something you guys are familiar with in the Midwest. But the race to the bottom of the aquifer was creating, arsenic poison. People's water was getting poisoned with arsenic. As you get lower and lower in the aquifer, you get more and more minerals, including some poisonous minerals in the water. So I'm watching that play out. And then in 2013, there was a massive storm surge that happened in the Midwest. And I was alerted to the work of this professor at Iowa State University, who was documenting just the alarming and massive soil erosion that was happening based on climate change was basically driving ever increasing winter and spring storms in the Midwest. The bare soil that you get when you only grow two crops, corn and soybeans, was essentially leaving that soil vulnerable to erosion. And you were getting these massive erosion events. And I didn't feel like very many people were writing about it. And I thought to myself, well, the Corn Belt is where our meat comes from. Ultimately, even if it's fattened in feedlots in North Carolina or in the Deep South, the corn and soybeans for the whole system are coming from that area. And now I've got two areas that are really the key nodes of food production in the US. It's the center of your plate, the meat, and the sort of side of your plate where the fruits and vegetables are coming from, both in a state of decline. And I know there are many other places where food is grown in the United States, but those are the two key ones. And I was thinking, this is something that someone like me needs to pay more attention to and sort of bring together for people that, like, essentially your entire basis for stocking the grocery store that you go to is from two areas that are having serious ecological trouble.
And just to stay in that vein a little bit further, how then is climate change exacerbating that, extractive way of farming, both in California with the water and in the soil erosion you reference in the Corn Belt?
Yeah, and let's start in California because it's actually really interesting. So the 20th century ends up being a pretty anomalous century in California. You've got scientists looking back at sort of the paleo record in California. And it turns out what they find is that the 20th century was abnormally wet. So, plenty of precipitation. And it was, there weren't a whole lot of there were definitely some severe storms and floods, but nothing too cataclysmic. And so in this century, that's pretty anomalous, is when you get the massive growth of the infrastructure that created the Central Valley as a food powerhouse, that incredible multi-billion-dollar canals and dams and aqueducts that rose up in the 20th century to make this Mediterranean climate of California. It's a classic Mediterranean climate, long hot summers, very mild winters. You can essentially grow food there all year round. And the magic ingredient in Mediterranean climates is water. And with the Sierra Nevada mountains, California had it in abundance. And what's been clear since is that in the 21st century, we're seeing some severe changes. People that were farming there in the, as recently as the 70s and 80s 1970s and 80s weren't seeing. And that is that the Sierra Nevada snowpack is shrinking with time. You can look at down, sort of 5-year averages and see it shrinking with time. So there's less, annual weather-related water available. The other problem is that, so you're also getting way warmer temperatures. The summers have gotten hotter. That means more evaporation, more need for water. The industry has responded by getting more efficient, by adding, by going to drip irrigation, but it's also gotten so big and ravenous that has been overcompensated for, and so we're still seeing this massive drawdown. And the other thing, and so if you look at climate models, if you talk to the best scientists at places like UCLA, what they're projecting is by the, let's say 2080s, and a downward trend until then, essentially a vanished snowpack. So now some years the snowpack doesn't come, you don't get very much winter, but that's unusual. But what they're talking about is, in the coming decades, years where we actually do get a snowpack will become the unusual ones. And so that is dire for California. And as California gets fewer winter storms, the ones that do come are potentially cataclysmic. And there's a whole chapter in my book that makes a pretty clear case that the potential for a massive megastorm that puts the Central Valley under 20 feet of water is actually more likely than not. So you get this sort of twin threat of drought and cataclysmic, really unimaginable by modern sensibilities, flooding. There was actually a flood in 1861-62 that I discussed in the book that was has long been thought to be an anomaly, a 1,000-year event that's actually probably more like a 100-year event. And so that area needs to be, and also we who eat from that area need to be gearing up for that. And in the Midwest, it's actually really simple. So weather that hits the Midwest in the spring, the sort of winter and spring comes from the Gulf of Mexico. And the Gulf of Mexico is getting warmer and warmer. And that means more evaporation and more rain, more sort of weather coming in from the Gulf and hitting the area. And when you've only grow two crops, corn and soybeans, and they are planted at the same time and harvested at the same time. The problem is that they're bare exactly when these storms, your fields are bare when these storms come. And bare fields are a catastrophe because there's no living roots to hold the soil in and no good vegetation to buffer it from the pounding of raindrops. And so what you get is the kind of cataclysmic soil erosion that I describe in my book. And so neither of these things, and in California and also in the Corn Belt, the story doesn't end well if we keep going like we are.
Right. Before we rewrite to perhaps a different ending, let's stay a little bit more on the perilous side of your book with your experience as a financial journalist. Really informs your exploration of the corporate role in agribusiness in this mix, right? So tell us how your understanding of the finances of all this shape the role big money plays in big ag, and maybe why this has sort of stuck us into this model for so long.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few things that I picked up as a financial journalist that really have informed the way I look at it. One of them is basically what economists call market power, and this is something that that your sort of Wall Street financial wizards are looking for when they're looking for investments. When looking for, hey, what's a good company to invest in? They want a company that has market power, that has the power to control prices. No company can completely control prices, but have leverage to control prices. And so that way, you're not a price taker. You get to have some say in what your goods cost, and you can use your market power to ensure that your product is profitable. And obviously, commodity farmers don't have market power, right? They're all doing the same thing. They're all growing corn and soybeans. They're competing with their neighbors. They're competing with, if you're in Ohio, you're competing, and you're doing that, you're competing with your neighbors in Iowa. And also you're competing with people in Brazil and Argentina. So if you're a Wall Street investor, you're not going to invest in, a 2,000 acre farm. That's not going to make sense. Well, who's got market power in that field? Well, who's got market power are companies that can that dominate a market to an extent where if you're a buyer in that market, you have to buy their goods. And I'm thinking of something like seeds and pesticides. At this point, there are 4 companies that dominate both of those markets. So they're Bayer, which now owns Monsanto, Syngenta, which is owned by a Chinese chemical company called ChemChina. There's Corteva, which is a combination of Dow and DuPont. And then, basically BASF, which is a European firm. These companies dominate these markets. And so while farmers are on a treadmill in the area of, basically taking a price and essentially getting less for their corn and soybeans than the cost of production, which puts the burden on keeping the system going on farm policy, basically federal farm policy. These companies are in a position of charging extra for their seeds because they can. If you want to compete with their neighbors and maximize your yields, you're probably going to buy the same, Corteva or Bayer seeds. And so they make a profit and the farmers don't. And I think that same kind of idea of market power is happening in a place like California, which the pistachio and almond markets are largely dominated, or at least let's say influenced, by a company called Wonderful, which has huge groves as well as their processors. They're vertically integrated. And so they're able, and then they've got a growing, whereas the corn and soybean market is essentially stagnant. I mean, it grows as the global appetite for meat grows, which ends up being pretty slow. There is a booming demand for nuts in places like China and even Europe. And so those markets give, you know, the existence of those markets and the way that Wonderful has so much market share gives them some market power. So they're a pretty good play. But you know, I did learn from, you know, talking to financial analysts back in the day when I was a financial writer to look for market power in the system. And I sure did find places where it was and places where it wasn't.
Right. And that market power translates to political power too, right? To help shape the policies that perpetuate their success.
No doubt. I mean, if you're a smart company who has market power and you're making pretty good profits, let's say selling inputs to farmers, it makes good economic sense to take some of those profits and set them aside and spend them on things like campaign finance and on lobbying. And with those things in hand, you can also get a monopoly on political power and, you know, make it really hard to move something like the once every 5-year farm bill, because you basically help create a system where everyone takes your viewpoint. And they've been, you know, very, very smart about that.
Yeah. So you wrote this book over the course of several years, watching what was happening in California, watching the soil erosion in the Corn Belt, primarily in Iowa. And you portend these sort of looming environmental disasters that will happen if topsoil is depleted or a great flood comes to California. But the current pandemic, which happened after your book went to print, really, has revealed some of the cracks, right, in our food system. Canceled contracts, broken supply chains, vegetables left unpicked in the field, or milk dumped. We've read headlines about that. And we've also, it's exposed workers' conditions in meatpacking industry. You know, how do you think, how has the pandemic kind of begun to shine a light on some of both the cracks and the opportunities for a new path forward in our food system that have given you some lift in recent months?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, I think we should say and acknowledge that the system, in terms of sort of like the supermarket system, that and the sort of like, you know, can you go to a corporate chain and get a, you know, fast food meal for $5? I think we have to acknowledge that's all held up pretty well. There's been disruptions. Obviously, certain products have been hard to find. But the overall sort of industrial system has been pretty resilient because there's just so much money invested in that infrastructure. Where it has been exposed as a really destructive force, I think, has been, as you mentioned, for workers. One of the ways that this industry, broadly speaking, really exerts its market power is over labor. It's done a really good job of, creating and taking advantage of a situation where most of the really hard labor is done by very vulnerable communities, immigrants, even literally refugees is a major source of labor for the meat industry. Prisons are a major source of labor for both row farming and also even in meat packing. That's definitely a thing. And since there is so much market power in place of those companies and in place of large growers in the case of vegetables, and so little labor power, we've seen even like a hardened observer of the scene like me has just been in shock at the way that the federal government has essentially sacrificed these workforces. I've done quite a bit of coverage of the meatpacking story, and the way that the federal government has just absented itself and allowed these companies to force their workers to work in conditions where social distancing is absolutely impossible. People are working shoulder to shoulder as we speak right now. There are shifts of people working shoulder to shoulder in meatpacking plants with maybe a flimsy mask and maybe a very flimsy divider between them. And it's no surprise that that industry was absolutely just ripped by the coronavirus. And I just hope my hope from that is that we learn that we also put our eyes on it. People who don't have to work in those things, we put our eyes on it, and let's not take our eyes off of it as this crisis goes on. We need to have solidarity with those workers, and it's the same with farm laborers and row crops. In terms of hope, one thing that I have seen is that that it has this crisis has definitely increased demand for local and regional food. People are thinking more about where their food comes from and maybe wanting to get out of these destructive industrial networks. And there are certainly challenges for things like farmers markets and small scale, meat producers, regionally based meat producers. And there's just been a lot of innovation on how to do socially distanced pickups. And I think that that one of the things that's going to be challenging going forward is to get past the farmers market model. And what I mean by that is, I'm someone who used to be at a farmers market as a farmer, every Saturday at 6 a.m. And I've been a consumer at one, even way more than that. I love farmers markets, but the idea of, basically a weekly pop-up, with very specific hours that farmers go and act as shopkeepers, temporary shopkeepers, and consumers who have time, at that exact window of time, that can't be the only interface for local food. And I think that there's got to be other models. And I think that this crisis is creating a lot of innovation in that will live beyond the crisis itself, of how to bring, basically do other collective endeavors besides farmers markets to bring consumers and farmers together in a way that is more convenient for both than just farmers markets.
And using technology possibly safer than it would be in a pandemic, right?
Yeah, I think technology. I think the way that small growers and local food advocates have used information technology has been really inspiring. Sure.
So staying in that area for a little bit, in the last chapter, The Future of the Farm, where we start to talk about some of the possibilities and the solutions to these looming environmental crises, you say we've reached the limits of markets as movements, right? So why is simply this idea of voting with your fork, this kind of myth that we have about the farmers market as the solution, why is that simply not the solution, fork voting?
Yeah, so vote with your fork is a great idea. Everyone should vote with their fork. But here's the big problem. This idea has really taken root probably around the start of the 21st century. I was just looking at a chart of farmers markets, and from around 1995, they start to boom, and you get this steady growth, and they're only now starting to level off. And there's this ethos of I'm going to buy from my local market, and we're going to create this alternative. We're gonna basically upend industrial food and solve all the problems that my book is about. And what it turns out as, there have been amazing successes, explosion of farm to table restaurants, explosion of farmers markets, CSAs. But if you look at the percentage of calories being supplied, from different sources of the food system, that hasn't changed very much in the past 20 years. If you look at sales of food, this industrial model that I spent 2/3 of my book teasing out still dominates that. And so things are changing, but they're not changing fast enough or for enough people. And the kind of disasters that I write about in my book, they're not going to be solved by this anytime soon. And the disasters are coming at us pretty fast. Like climate change is not taking a break. And so we need to figure out more collective solutions than just voting with our forks. Is the you know, just the overwhelming conclusion that I came to looking at this material. And I say that as someone, you know, who was in the trenches of, you know, I was in a CSA in the late 90s in Brooklyn, and I, you know, worked on a small farm in North Carolina for 8 years. So I come from that movement, but I'm here to say that that it's not working fast enough by any stretch, and it's leaving way too many people out.
Right. And a quote I love that I shared with you as we're getting ready for today, a guy you work with frequently on some podcasts, Raj Patel, writer and thinker, says it's extraordinarily American for us to think that we can simply shop our way out of this problem, right?
That's right.
So some of the solutions you talk about in the book are ecological or farming based. You feature a farmer, in fact, in Ohio, in Fairfield County, who's doing some pretty cool things. Many of those of us here today may know of David Brandt in Carroll. Tell us a little bit about what he does and why that's exciting in this bigger context.
The thing that David Brandt figured out a long time ago, I think maybe back in the 70s or 80s, was that that the way that farming was moving in the Corn Belt, and including his part of the Corn Belt, was to less and less diversity. You know, basically, you know, I think his family farm, they had grown wheat, and that was going out of fashion. It's like, you know, why should we grow corn, soybeans, and wheat when our corn yields are so high? We get such, you know, such great land for corn. Why devote any of that to wheat? Let's take that out. And then, you know, you get into the 2000s, and you've got, if you know, Roundup Ready corn and soybeans, you can, you know, with a, you know, really easily just control all of your weeds. And so now you've just got corn and soybeans, you don't even have weeds to worry about. He figured out pretty early on that was just going to destroy soil. It was just leaving soil bare for the kind of storms I was talking about. And so, you know, he starts thinking about, well, how can I increase biodiversity on my farm? And, you know, in a very far-sighted way, he decided that one of the ways of biodiversity, one of the sort of nodes of biodiversity on a farm are in the soil, and that he needed to make the soil biome as diverse as possible and feed the soil as much as possible. And he also realized that he needed to protect his ground from these storms. And so the solution he comes up with is he's going to do no-till, which a lot of people do, but they do what I call chemical no-till, and they only do it maybe maybe for 2 or 3 seasons in a row, then they till. But he does continuous no-till, so he hasn't tilled the soil in decades, and that helps give, you know, a great habitat for the soil biome. And then he comes up with this idea, first of cover cropping, not a radical idea, but he was devoted to it. And then he realized that the more diverse that his cover crops were, the better it would be at protecting the soil, and the better it would be for feeding the soil biome. And so, you know, by this point, he's growing, you know, more than 10 species of cover crops. He's got grasses that draw down carbon and keep it in the soil, making the soil incredibly carbon rich. He's got legumes that fix nitrogen and basically eliminate the need for him to use nitrogen fertilizer. And then he's got radishes that draw these really deep roots that draw minerals from the subsoil and bring them up into the soil profile toward the top. And also create these air pockets that just this oxygen, you know, a place for oxygen to be, a place, easy ways for worms to get around. And also, so he's got this microbiota down there working that also frees up phosphorus that had been over applied on that land for a long time. And so that eliminates the need for him to apply phosphorus, which is causing nitrogen and phosphorus, causing all kinds of problems in the Midwest for water quality. And so he's got this incredibly robust system. And I visited him in 2013, after this, the drought of 2012, in which most of his neighbors saw brutal drought, they got about half or less of their usual yields, and he got 90% of his yields because his carbon-rich soil holds moisture and doesn't suffer as much when there's a drought. And then there had been this brutal spring of rains in 2013 that caused this huge erosion problem. And his fields there were no gullies. I mean, his fields were doing fantastic. And I'll never forget, you know, we went on a little field trip and we went to his neighbor's land and it had rained the night before, and we scratched, so you get this muddy soil, and we scratched the soil and it was dead dry beneath it. And so the soil was so sort of eroded and damaged that the rain hit it, created a mud layer, and then just ran off, taking some soil with it, taking chemicals with it. Then you go to Brandt's land and you poke your finger in, and it's just wet downwards. The water had percolated down. So if there was going to be a drought coming in 2013, he already had his water bank, stocked up. And so, yeah, he's, you people in Iowa, I'm sorry, in Ohio, you should definitely go check out his farm. He's doing amazing things.
Cool. So I think, what I was impressed with I think it's in that chapter of the book, The Big Lift. I was just trying to find the page. You cite a study, an Iowa study that sort of says, like, if just some of these simple techniques, big ag growers, corn and soy growers shift to, and it's not simple, obviously, they're big economic systems locking growers into some of these practices, but there are opportunities for some smaller changes like the ones you highlight that David's making, or a shift to a more diversified vegetable production, which can start to both supply us with, in a local food system, with more ingredients to choose from should there be environmental catastrophes in California, great flood or something like that. And that opportunity for that shift doesn't have to be the whole system changes, but those small steps, right, towards practice can have big impacts, not just on output, but on ecology.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask any agronomist in the Corn Belt, what would make a quick difference, and the answer would universally be adding a third or fourth crop to the rotation. Just if you could just not do corn and soybeans every year. And the study you're referring to, that's Matt Liebman's group at Iowa State University. And they're showing that just by adding a third or a fourth crop, it doesn't have to be a fourth crop even, it can just be a third crop. You would basically use a tiny fraction of the fertilizer and essentially eliminate the need for herbicides. If you did just broaden the crop rotation and do cover crops some years, you could just completely actually transform the system. And in terms of vegetables, I think it can be a little bit overstated because you can only put so much land into vegetable production in the area before you overwhelm the markets. And stuff like grain is great to grow over big expanses because you can store it. If you grow too much of it, it can sit in storage. Whereas it's a lot trickier with fruits and vegetables. And I think the revival, because you guys used to have it, a revival of processing infrastructure, canneries, ways to do freezing, things like that could help with that. But I don't think you could get more than, I don't think it would be a good idea to move more than a few percentage points of land over to fruit and vegetable production. But if you did that, you could essentially supply the entire Corn Belt with fruits and vegetables during the growing season and create a lot more economic value by doing that.
And I'll flag for our participants that notion of infrastructure, because we're going to get to it later in our summit today. But my last question for you before I open it up to the group really is not about that market solution and that, voting with your fork notion, or that growing solution that you refer to, but that political solution and the policies that may help to the system pivot to things that are more ecological, more socially just, and perhaps more in line with things the Ohio Food Policy Network are pursuing. You reference at the end of the book, I think something interesting about AOC and Markey's Green New Deal and their ag section, and how, unlike a lot of calls for policy, it's sort of an open chapter to say, this is where grassroots movements will start to identify their specific policies. And what I loved about the notion of that really is that's what the Ohio Food Policy Network is here to do. And in fact, what we're going to do in the next hour together is talk about our policy agenda for the year ahead. And I don't know if you've specifically written about, in whether for Mother Jones or in other articles, policy ideas that might start to fill that in, cool solutions in other places that folks are starting to figure out, or that we might want to consider here as we set up our conversation to talk about policy solutions. What have you been?
I'm really excited to have that conversation because Ohio is in such a crucial place because it's both in the Corn Belt and has, a lot of cities in Ohio have problems that are directly related to this corn and soybean plus giant hog factories kind of system, water quality issues in places like Toledo, Columbus. I'm sure people on wells have trouble with the polluted groundwater there. And also, just all of these corn and soybean farmers that are producing crops for less than the cost of production. That's a problem. You could be doing better than that. And then you've got urban areas that have things like food deserts, and you've got efforts like what you guys are doing there to try to build up local and regional food production and push for food justice, push for greater access. So you're at the forefront of all of the points that I bring up in the book. And I think that, federal policies, currently what they reward in terms of farming, and there's no good reason for this. There's no one made the case that this was the way forward and that it should be, and we're all convinced by it. But federal policies now are rewarding maximum production of corn and soybeans. And if that's not what you want, just reward something else. You could, I think, to me, the easiest thing would be that since the science is so overwhelming that crop diversification is a positive good, then I think that there should be farm policies could and should shift over to rewarding crop diversification. And I think that doing that is going to create voids it's going to expose voids in infrastructure, because the infrastructure in the Midwest exists to take corn and soybeans and either export them out of the area or export them into hog confinements or cattle confinements. And so you're going to need new infrastructure for crops like oats. You're going to need new infrastructure for animals that are taken out of the feedlot and put into the pasture. You're gonna need more slaughterhouses that aren't owned by Tyson or JBS. And so new problems are gonna be created that can be solved when you consider that we're paying between $5 and, in more recent years, more like $20 billion a year in federal subsidies just in farm programs and things like President Trump's parachuting cash into farm country after his trade wars. That money could be shifted over to paying farmers for diversification, taking some of the risk off their backs. And then also, I talk in the book about how California is a great place to grow food, but it's got these problems, and we probably need to de-emphasize California. California is always going to grow food, but we need to de-emphasize it and boost production more in places like Ohio. And so just figure out, I think the Ohio Food Policy Council would be a great place to go for the federal government to go and say, look, if we wanted you to increase fruit and vegetable production by 30% over the next 20 years, what would you need? What sort of investments would you need? And those kinds of conversations are what I wish were happening and I think could happen with a Green New Deal. I think a Green New Deal could be about those kinds of conversations. I think the election and the way that that Congress is going to be really divided are going to make that those conversations really difficult. But there is appetite for responding to climate change, and I hope that California's problems with adapting to climate change, its agriculture's problems, will be part of that conversation. And I don't think we need to make a carbon case that, oh, it's lower carbon if you buy at your farmer's market. I think that the carbon emissions from fruit and vegetable production aren't something that are going to move the needle. We know that we need to eat more fruits and vegetables and less meat. But I think that as an adaptation to climate change strategy, regions like Ohio producing more food should definitely be on the table. And I think it's like, don't ask me what you need in your area. You guys know, you guys have been at this for a while. And I just think federal support for what you're doing would be really, really important. And putting, more money in people's hands to buy healthy food on the other side would be a great thing. Increasing expenditures for anti-hunger programs. I think the national school lunch, I think we're at another point when we can have that conversation that we know that policy tweaks like what Michelle Obama did do have an effect. They do create a more healthy diet. And now we're at a point where we can talk about universal free lunch with, healthy food made by workers paid a decent wage from scratch with food grown around there could be a major economic driver. And I think that those are the kinds of conversations, like, revaluing school lunch and making it better. And right now, school lunch exists to reinforce the idea that food is industrial, food is full of added sugars and added fats. And it could be a venue for teaching people that, hey, there's this other thing out there. There's other ways to enjoy food, other tastes to cultivate. And I think that we can have that conversation now. Now that we've seen this sort of crazy attack on school lunch by the Trump administration.
Sure. So I'm scanning the questions in the Q&A, and I feel like some of your answers, parts of your answer has gotten at some of these questions. And without throwing you a big curveball question, we do have one about land ownership that I'm just going to read rather than paraphrase. How much is the way land is owned contributing to our food system problems? Is it harder or simpler for farms of a certain scale to adopt some of the policies that would make? And it just moved on me, so now I can't keep reading it. Okay,
Well,
let's talk about land ownership here, and I'll get back to
land ownership. I think is I think the key question going forward, and it's going to be a focus of my book going forward. And I think that we're on this we're on in this country this sort of individual family farm model, and we've seen where it's gotten us. It's gotten us to a point where farmland is really, really expensive. One of the things that I think is missing from my book, when you write a book and you start thinking of all the stuff that you left out, but there's very little for compensation for corn and soybean farmers from planting corn and soybeans, unless you're really big and you can get enough of those programs, those federal programs, to make a decent profit. But where you do benefit is appreciation in land prices that have been very, very steady, and they've come off a little bit from the end of the ethanol boom, but they're still really, really high. And that makes it really hard for new farmers to come in and do new things. And what it does is it just increases pressure on, you know, the only person who can afford that land is another farmer with lots and lots of money because he's already got a whole bunch of land. And so we see this steady consolidation of ownership. And so I think we're going to need to figure out policy ways to do something like land redistribution in some kind of fair way, because otherwise, like, who are the young farmers who aren't from a farm family who are going to come into the Corn Belt and take over these farms? I think it's an open question, and I think, you know, some kind of public land trust idea could come into effect where people are compensated for their land, but then you don't have to be a gazillionaire in order to buy it. You know, we can come up with a system that creates opportunities. And I think that, as was alluded to earlier in the program, of course, we've got, you know, African-American farmers were systematically had their land stolen in the 20th century. You know, there were, I think, 15% of farmers were Black in the 1920s, and now it's, you know, less than a few percentage points. And that isn't because of people's desires. That's because people were kicked off the land for various reasons. And I think that needs to be addressed, and also the Native American land seizure. And I have been doing some reporting recently on this new generation of young people of color who are going into farming and figuring out new cooperative models that I think are really interesting going forward. But I mean, I got to say, I don't have the answer to the land ownership dilemma, but I do think it's like the next big dilemma that that we need to pay attention to, and I plan to do some work on it. So watch this space, watch my author page on Mother Jones.
Cool. So also talking in the solution side of things, how do a couple of people have upvoted a question around new markets? How do they fit into our future needs? Examples include payment for ecosystem services or carbon sequestration in the soil, developing markets for cover crops, forage crops, and livestock, redeveloping markets for smaller grains, for brewing and distilling, for example.
Great questions. I think they play a big role. I think that the thing that I caution against is that the idea that there are going to be private companies. So I'm going to put back on my financial advisor hat. So this is a very low margin. Anyone who knows farming, whether you're at the farmer's market or a soybean grower, you know that it's a pretty low margin business. And the value from it, especially in the commodity end, ends up getting taken by these big input suppliers or big buyers like ADM or meat companies. They're the ones that end up grabbing the value. And the idea that a private company is going to come in and make a bunch of money for its investors and also, you know, pump a bunch of money into farms, I'm just not buying that. So what I think is that these payments for for ecosystem services and, you know, stuff like, I think the technology will come around where we can pretty easily measure carbon in soil and pay farmers to sequester carbon in soil. I don't think we're there yet for, you know, easy low cost technology, but I think it's probably on the way. But I think that we can't, the private market is not going to do that. I think that all those companies trying to do that, they're either going to lose their shirts or move to something else. And I think that it's going to have to be a public effort. And I think that that is fine because, like I said, we're already pumping billions of dollars into the current system, and that could be redirected into stuff like ecosystem services payments. And I think stuff like new markets for things like small grains, I think they are probably going to need a public boost before they can take off. I think the investments in infrastructure are going to be really difficult. I think some kind of grant program to get that stuff off the ground. I think there's interest in it. I think farmers want to do it. I think there are a lot of consumers that want to do it, but there's an infrastructure gap that the federal government might need to step in for. But I, in general, I think that stuff is really exciting. I just think there's going to have to be a public role because if there's a Silicon Valley, and there are Silicon Valley companies thinking that, telling their investors, hey, we're going to make a lot of money, we're going to do well by doing good, and create, transform American farmland. I just don't see that happening. There just isn't enough money out there in growing commodities to make a bunch of money for shareholders and also treat farmers fairly.
And what I'm hoping some of what you shared today too can be inspiration for ideas that we're not necessarily taking in mass movements to the Farm Bill or to the federal government, but piloting in our state and our communities, whether that's local policies or local practices that inform those bigger collective efforts. As somebody's asked in the Q&A, and a couple of folks have upvoted, this notion that change at the federal level is inevitably glacial, right? So perhaps some of these ideas can be piloted here locally, either with local or statewide policies, or local and statewide practices that
Definitely.
we might begin to embrace. We have a minute or two left without putting you on the spot to tie a bow up on all of it. If there were easy changes to agricultural practices that could have big and short-term effects and impacts, are there any that you've written about and seen, or that you would recommend for us to, or anybody interested in seeing some of these changes come about, to embrace quickly?
I mean, I just think that the food system, for like the economy at large, for a good long time, for many decades, has been built on efficiency. And I think there are lots and lots of efficiencies to be gained from paying workers $12 an hour to harvest or to process meat under brutal conditions, and to basically pay farmers less than the cost of production because they're all growing the same thing, or to basically let your own farm sector in your area go because you can get your fruits and vegetables really cheaply from California. These have created this incredibly efficient system, but I think it's now time for us, and I think because of climate change, I think we're not going to have much choice. And I think that people are starting to realize this, that efficiency is great, but it's not the only thing. And we need to build redundancy into the system. We need to have a system where if one thing breaks down in one place, it doesn't make everyone hungry. And so I think that just anything that, I think we should think about adding biodiversity to systems, because corn, growing just corn and soybeans is super efficient. It's way easier than having a third crop in the rotation. But making biodiversity a key issue in a key goal, getting biodiversity back into the conversation, thinking about redundancy, thinking about worker rights, because one of the things is that people are only going to do jobs like that when they absolutely have to. We've already, like I said, we're already reverted, even before COVID, to refugees and prisoners to be meat processors. That's obviously not sustainable. We need to figure out ways to make those jobs more attractive, more fair, better paying. And I think that's going to it is going to force us to create an entire new economy that's not just based on efficiency. But I think the food system could be a leader in that. It can be something. This is something that Michael Pollan said a long time ago. We interact with 3 times a day. We go to the grocery store, we go to a restaurant. And I think that that the food system can be a harbinger that leads us into a better and more fair economy that has redundancy built into it that'll help us get through these coming shocks of climate change. Is, I guess, how I'd answer the question.
Yeah, no, and while I'm certain you probably didn't think you were releasing a book in the middle of a pandemic, maybe the pandemic pulled back the curtain on a little bit of these future shocks to really kind of illustrate the value in those redundancies and in that biodiversity, that we can really start to point to the bounty side instead of the perilous side of your book.
Well
So
done.
thank you. And I'm going to conclude by recognizing at the end of your book, you credit living among smart, challenging people and reading smart, challenging things to the success and what's interesting in your work. And so I put that back to you to say, thank you for being among the smart, challenging people who's writing the smart, challenging things that we're reading. Thank you for being that in my life. Thank you for sharing that with everybody here today. And thank you for joining us for the Ohio Food Policy Network's Summit.
I'm very honored because what you guys are doing, like I said, it's so important. And thank you so much for the great questions, Amy, and to the questions that we got from the folks listening in. Thank you so much.
For everybody else on this Zoom, now is the time in our meeting when we're going to take a 15-ish minute break. We're going to reconvene at 2:30, so you can turn your camera off and walk away from your computer, stretch your legs a little bit, stretch your brain, and be prepared to come back ready to go at 2:30, where we're actually really going to dig into the policy framework of the food policy, the OFPN, and really start to populate it with specific policies, whether they are inspired by what Tom shared with us today or reflect the work that you come to this network experienced in. We're really excited to be able, even through Zoom, to be interacting together and start building out these things. So with that, don't log out of Zoom. But do take a break from your screen and we'll come back at 2:30. Thanks, everybody.
All right, everybody, just a second while I pull up our next screen, which will be a roadmap for the policy session. Um, All right, it looks like we have most of our participants back. I'll go ahead and welcome everybody, and I'll get started introducing myself here in a minute. Let me just check that we are all set to go here. All right. So I hope that everybody has gone ahead and joined us on menti.com using the code 948988. We'll be using that for this session, which we're really excited about. This is the policy generation and hopefully prioritization session for deciding where the Ohio Food Policy Network Steering Committee should focus on statewide policy changes coming up in the coming year. So I'm going to start off by introducing myself and going through a brief roadmap of the session that we'll be doing today. So I'm Amy Lee. I'm actually the Associate Director over at the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability at Ohio State here. And what we are normally what I'm doing is doing town halls for members of Congress and also kind of statewide legislators sometimes as well. And what we do a lot of in those is actually mostly just kind of take questions and get a little bit of feedback from participants. So we're looking forward to doing something a bit more interactive and engaging with you all today, actually having you all generate some policy ideas in some of the main priority areas that have been identified previously throughout the network's work. And then if we are able to do so, depending on the number of ideas that you are all are able to generate, even getting into prioritization of those as well. So let me give you a brief roadmap for today's session. As you can see on the menti.com page, if you want to go ahead and go make sure you go to menti.com and use the code 9488 to share that. Let me go ahead and do this. There we go. So what we'll start off with is explaining our goal for today's session, which we'll do in just a little bit. Then we'll give a little bit of background information about it from one of our steering committee members who can explain some of the work that's already been in progress on this, where it comes from and what we're hoping to accomplish in today's session, and go into a little bit more detail about each of the policy priority areas that have already been developed. And then we'll get into policy generation, and we'll try to spend about an hour or so on that. And if we are able to get to it, the policy prioritization itself. So we'll be looking at developing policies in each of 4 priority areas that we'll be sharing in just a couple of minutes. And then we'll discuss that we will generate those ideas. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we will go on to kind of discuss those, clarify them, make sure that we have shared understanding of what everybody means by these. And then after we've reviewed those, if we are able to, we'll get into prioritizing those and looking to see if there's a clear top tier that emerges amongst them. If we end up having too many good ideas, that is not a big problem to have, but what we'll want to do is share, is just make sure that we get through and understand all of those, and we can kind of look across them at the end and see about, and we can just kind of verbally discuss a top tier of items to move forward on. So let me go ahead and move forward on this one. There we go. All right, so as I mentioned, the policy priorities that we're going to be talking about today focus on four primary issues that have been developed through the long time work of the organization. This is obviously not the first summit that the Ohio Food Policy Network has held. And so we're going to be bringing in Angela Blatt to talk a little bit about the previous work and how these policy priority areas were developed. And then also to talk a little bit about the equity lens. We're not thinking of equity as a separate bucket of issues, but it kind of as a way to actually operationalize and implement all of these. And then to go into a little bit of detail about what each of the four policy priority areas are. So with that, I will turn this over to Angela.
Thank you, Amy. My name is Angela Blatt, and I'm with the Initiative for Food and Agricultural Transformation at Ohio State. I'm also the vice chair for the Ohio Food Policy Network Steering Committee. And as Amy mentioned, I just wanted to take a few minutes to set the stage for this session so that you know how we got to this point as a network. Ohio Food Policy Network was founded by stakeholders who shared a vision for a food system in Ohio that is sustainable, healthful, equitable, resilient, and accessible. So over the past 2 years, we've really been focused on building the structure of the network, including, as Michelle mentioned earlier, forming a steering committee. And we've been working together to determine our priorities and our activities that will achieve greater progress towards the stated values and goals for the network. And now we're focusing on what our policy priorities should be to achieve our shared vision. So over the last year, we formed a committee to establish 4 high-level policy priorities. And those are local farms, access and education, infrastructure, and institutions. And in your email to prep you for today's summit, you should have received a link to pre-summit materials, which has more detail about the background of the network, the values and goals, and it also lists the policy priorities with a little bit more detail. But I just wanted to go over them really quick here so that they're fresh in your mind. And thank you, Amy, for putting those up on the screen. So the first one, local farms. So we're looking at policies that encourage the growth and production of farms in all areas of the state, particularly those small and mid-scale farms that serve Ohio markets, embrace responsible, resilient production methods, and fair labor practices. Number 2, access and education. Policies that increase access for locally grown, healthy, and affordable food for all Ohioans, and focus on food education as fundamental to addressing diet-related disease. Infrastructure, policies that develop the civic, social, physical, economic, and values-based infrastructure necessary for aggregation, distribution, processing, and retail to integrate local and regional supply chains. And that one's a mouthful. And then finally, institutions. So looking at food purchasing policies that reduce barriers for institutional buyers and drive the development of local and regional markets. So keeping those in mind with this session, we really hope to identify specific policy ideas within these 4 buckets to guide our work moving forward. And I should mention just a couple of things. This won't be the only time that you would have the opportunity to provide ideas within these buckets or to prioritize. We're hoping to continue this conversation past the summit. And then also mention that while opportunities for short-term wins are great, we're also looking further into the future over the long term. So with that brief introduction, I'll turn it back to Amy to provide further detail and instruction as we move into the discussion.
All right. Thank you very much, Angela. So let me just go and talk a little bit more about our goal for today's session and kind of the parameters for the policy ideas that we want to come up with all of your amazing help today. So the steering committee recognizes that in order for the network to be the network needs to be fully engaged in creating these strategic policy goals. So obviously, because our food systems have never been more important, there's so much that we all can do and are already doing in our local communities to take action on various things that would improve the local food system. But there are certain things, as was kind of mentioned in some of the talk earlier, that are common obstacles that are faced by everybody across the state, and are also common goals that would help everybody in the state to achieve more together. So our goal here is to really hear from folks about what are the most key crucial challenges to be addressed, or key goals that really need to go first in order for us all to kind of progress as a food system more together. So just a couple of notes about the kinds of things that we're trying to generate here. As Angela mentioned, we're basically trying to come up with ideas that would fall into those 4 main key policy buckets. And so the things that we're thinking about are first and most importantly, that these are statewide. So there may certainly be particular challenges that we might face in a particular local system, whether it might be kind of zoning rules on, whether or not you can keep chickens or things like that, or kind of other like local challenges to do with, environmental remediation or things like that. But what we're trying to think of here is a statewide policy. Now, certainly challenges that are faced in local communities could very definitely be common across them. So I would say, don't think that just because you are facing it particularly in your community, it doesn't mean it's a statewide policy. But as we're creating these, and I'll give you the instructions for how to do that in just a little bit, think about making sure that they are things that could be implemented. Think about phrasing them in ways that they could be implemented statewide. The other item to remember is that this is policies that we're looking for, not programming. So there are lots of different policy ideas that I know that people have discussed, but these tend to be about changing rules or processes or incentive structures rather than actually coming up with new programs. So for example, one of the policies that I know people have been thinking about is creating a nutritional education in schools pilot program. So this would actually, we would call this a policy change because it's something that the statewide Board of Education would work to make a policy program, would work to make a policy change. And it might certainly at some point involve a collaboration with the Ohio Food Policy Network and the individual producers and other folks to eventually develop programming. But the idea of starting a pilot program would be a policy change. So, and I'll just remind folks to also, if you have questions about these kind of things, you can go ahead and enter those either in the Q&A box here. I will apologize for having to switch between sometimes the Zoom and the Menti window, and it might look a little messy here. Sorry about that. Trying to kind of juggle screens on one laptop from here at home. But so in just a moment, we will go ahead and I'll explain exactly how we're going to get started on that and the timing for it. But just kind of keep those statewide and policy parameters in mind. I'll repeat what Angela said as well. If we end up with lots of great ideas, that is a wonderful problem to have. And these don't have to be incredibly specific. You don't necessarily have to know the particular department in Ohio and Ohio's government that would implement it, or you don't have to necessarily have an organization in mind for who would advocate for it. But we do want to just go ahead and put your ideas out there. We really want this to be generative and just get a sense of where people think the most crucial policy items to undertake as a state are. And again, one more time, just to reiterate, this will not be your only chance to come up with these ideas. We're going to, after this session, the steering committee is going to figure out the best way to circulate not only what is generated here, but to also share that with the rest of the larger network. And here we've got a question here in the Q&A. I will take that in just a second. So in just a moment, I will switch us over to Menti. You should all be able to see the screen here. And let me check the Q&A here. Q&A. How big? There we go. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and move us over into the next stage. So here is the policy idea generation stage. So if you're logged into menti.com, you should be able to see, and you use the code 94898 to join this. We're now all on the policy generation local farms. So we're going to spend about the next 20 minutes going through each of the 4 policy priority areas. We're going to give each section about 5 minutes or so, however long it takes folks to go ahead and enter those ideas. And if we were doing this in person, how we'd probably do it was we'd have 4 big whiteboards and we'd give everybody Post-it notes and we'd say, write your idea on them, put your name at the bottom of it and post it in the bucket that it wants to go to. For ease of use with this, we are going to have to do this one at a time here in Menti so that we can do this online. But what you'll want to do is just go ahead and click the submit question button or submit comment. And what you can do is you can submit multiple ideas if you have them. If you feel comfortable, you may want to put your name at the very end of it so that when we go to discussing these at the end of them, if we have any questions about what exactly you're meaning with a policy, or we're wondering, hey, this looks really similar to another one, we want to combine them, that we'll be able to know who submitted what, and it'll make it easier to kind of share that out. So I see that you guys have already got the hang of this, and this is fantastic. So it's always kind of difficult to tell exactly how quickly how simple the process is and how quickly people will be able to engage on this, but I'm already seeing a lot of ideas show up on this. So we're going to go ahead and spend about the next 5 minutes. If you have ideas, go ahead and submit those. If you feel comfortable, but you don't have to at all for any reason, if you don't necessarily want to share your name after the idea, go ahead and enter that so we can discuss these later. So we'll spend 5 minutes. I'll just kind of let this go while you all submit your ideas for local farms, and then we'll move on to our next one, which would be access and education. So I'm seeing a lot of ideas come in. Go ahead and keep them coming. We've got about 3 more minutes on this one. Not seeing any open Q&A questions yet. Great. All right, just another minute or 2 on this one. Local farms, obviously a very, very popular one. All right, I'm still seeing ideas coming in from you all on this. This is a lot of them, and so our plan for how we're going to do this policy priority or policy generation session is to go through each one of the 4 options and to just generate the ideas and then come back and review them. If we have a manageable amount of ideas, we were going to go ahead and try to do a dot voting exercise at the end that would allow us to kind of see what the top tier is. But I'm seeing so many ideas here that I think that we're going to end up needing a lot more time just to discuss and make sure that we have kind of shared understanding about this. And I don't think we'd be able to have a manageable way of getting these into a dot voting format. So what we'll do is we'll discuss them, and we'll discuss verbally. We'll allow people to either raise their hands and speak if they'd like to, or just enter questions or comments through the Q&A function and upvote those. And that's how we'll try to discern prioritization at the end. But I'm going to give everybody one more. We're a little bit over so far on this one, but this is great stuff, and I don't want to cut this off as long as you all are coming up with ideas on this. So we'll continue to go ahead and give you just another minute on local farms before we move on to access and education, our next one. All right, everybody. It looks like we're just getting our very, very last ideas in here. So if we can go ahead and if you can want to finish up whichever policy suggestion that you are entering now, we are going to have a lot to review here when we come back to this section. All right. So with that, I am going to go ahead and move us on to the access and infrastructure screen. So same thing, we're basically going to be submitting ideas. And again, the idea would be just if we were coming up with, if we were doing a brainstorming session in person, this would be writing your ideas on a Post-it note and posting them up in the access and education whiteboard. So if you feel comfortable, go ahead and put your name on the comment as you submit it, just dash your name at the end of it if you'd like to. It might make it a little bit easier to discuss these large, this large number of items that we have when we come back to this one. You'll notice that we have a couple of these ideas already up here. And so these were some that were submitted by some of our steering committee members beforehand as things that have been proved successful in other states. So these are things that you can upvote if you'd almost like. And how you can do that is by sharing, just typing in your comment, agree that we should establish a nutrition education in schools pilot program, or agree we should create a statewide financial and regulatory incentives for development of grocery stores. So that is fine to do too. When it comes to kind of other upvoting and prioritization, we'll do that via discussion and Q&A at the end. So don't worry about that. But if there's anything that was already here that wasn't generated by you folks, you can go ahead and just enter that as a comment as well. There. Don't forget, if you're having any questions about, kind of the substance of what we're doing or about Menti or anything else, you can go ahead and enter those in the Q&A function of the Zoom. I know we're asking folks to kind of have 2 browser windows open, so I hope it's not too confusing. It is a bit to manage. Some really, really great ideas coming in here. You all can see when you're looking, when you finished in the Menti window where you're submitting, you can actually see on the screen that I'm sharing some of the other ideas that have been coming in from participants. Some really, really exciting ones coming in here. All right, looks like we're slowing down just a little bit on the access and education ideas yet. So I'll give everybody just about another minute or so to go ahead and enter any last ideas in this. This is a whole bunch. We're going to, it looks like we have some that are a little bit similar, and maybe we can discuss about kind of consolidating some of these when we kind of review them, but there's also just a wide variety of ideas. So we have a lot to kind of recap when we come back to this one. So just one more minute on this, and then we will move on to infrastructure. All right, and I'm going to go ahead now. Thank you very much, everybody, for all your submissions. If we do end up having any kind of, if you have any ideas after we've switched on to the next slide, you can enter those into the Q&A section of the Zoom if you'd like. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and move us on to our next policy priority area, which is infrastructure. And again, we've started off with a couple of policy items that steering committee members have thought were good examples of statewide policy items that could go ahead and be implemented. And so for infrastructure, I'll just recall for you all one more time. So what we're looking for here is that a strengthened local and regional food supply chain will increase resilience, economic growth for Ohio communities. So these are all policies that would develop the civic, social, physical, economic, and values-based infrastructure necessary for aggregation, distribution, processing, and retail to integrate local and regional supply chains. So how we actually create those connections between all the different segments of the food system. We're looking for ideas about infrastructure and ways to build that, and particularly policies that might be necessary. Do you all have ideas about policies that might be missing from doing this, that kind of prevent infrastructure from being kind of created or being used? Or is there a gap that's identified? I see some coming in here, and yeah, go ahead. All right, give you all just a few more minutes on this one as well. Oh, the other thing, we've got a great comment from Ken here who mentions that do click go to slide to switch into the next one in Menti. so that you can make sure that you're on the same current bucket that we're all trying to work in. Right. Couple more minutes on this one. While you all are doing this, we are in the background getting kind of clustering the previous submissions that you all have done together so that we can kind of discuss them a little bit more easily and make sure that we understand them properly, and we can maybe get a sense of how to prioritize them as we go forward. Just reading these as they come in, there's some really, really interesting ideas in here. All right. Just about another minute or so on this one. It looks like ideas are slowly kind of slowing down here. So it looks like you all are just about ready to move on to institutions. All right, just seeing a couple more coming in. All right, I'm going to go ahead. Thank you all, everybody, for all these ideas on infrastructures. There will be a lot to review here. I'm going to go ahead and move us on to institutions now. So again, what we're looking for here are some statewide policies that would help to create and expand markets for local food by vastly expanding their local food purchases. So we're thinking about big institutions and the food purchasing policies that would reduce barriers for these kind of institutional buyers and drive the development of local and regional markets. So you can see a couple of ideas that steering committee members have kind of taken and put in there as examples. You can say that you think these are great examples to go with. And of course, I'm sure you'll have your own as well. So go ahead and enter those in. All right, we are working in the background as you all are submitting your ideas actually to kind of get these ready so that we can kind of discuss them. We are going to need a couple of minutes. I have some very excellent helpers from the steering committee organizing all of this, and we are just trying to make sure that we get everything from all the ones that you all have submitted previously into a list that we can share out and kind of walk through and discuss together. So we're probably going to need just a couple of minutes as we do this, just to kind of get the last ones that you are just completing now into a format that we can share back. We'll probably need just a couple of minutes. So continue entering ideas for institutions here. And in just a couple of seconds, I'm going to turn off my video just for a minute so I can work on this with our behind the scenes crew. And then we'll be, actually, I'll leave my video on just so I can kind of continue to hear any questions that you all might have. And then we'll move into the discussion part in just a couple of minutes as soon as we've got something ready to share out. Right. All right, I'm going to give you all just a couple more minutes to review these, and we're going to figure out the best way to kind of share these back with you all right now. So I'm going to mute myself for just a couple of minutes, but please don't go. We will be ready to share these back and start discussing back at local farms in just a moment. All right, everybody. So as you can see from the list that we have generated here, there were a lot of really, really great ideas shared, like more than we can possibly fit into a workable format for dot voting. But it actually does seem like this, in addition to the variety of ideas that were shared, there's a fair bit of similarity as well. So we can kind of discuss how some of these might fit together. So we've decided the best way to do this is actually for me to share a Google Doc with you all. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen, the Menti screen, and we're going to go on to sharing a Google Doc where our trusty backend team has taken and downloaded all of the ideas that you all submitted and shared them that way. So let me go ahead and share this screen with you. There we go. Everybody should be able to see that. So let me make sure. And again, I apologize for this being a little bit wonky. We'd hope to be able to use Menti to do this, but there's a little bit of lag time with so many ideas coming out and them being able to be downloaded. So we're just going to share the Google Doc, and you all will be as part of this working process. And hopefully that's what you all are signing up for anyway. So what we'll go ahead and do is talk about our local farms one here. So I think the thing to start off with on this discussion is it seems like there were a number of themes or clusters of different policy ideas. So we'll kind of walk through those together, and then we'll come back to talk about some of the specific policies and discuss if there is any kind of like thing that we want to clarify about who might do what or exactly what we're talking about or what level or anything like that. So under local farms, we had a number of ideas about land transfer, access, and ownership. So you can see many of the different ideas that were submitted by you all in there. So incentivizing transfer of land, not only to next generation of farmers, but beginning farmers of kind of any type, structures by which we might do that, land trust models or other kind of incentives for doing that kind of thing. Transitioning ownership to younger and BIPOC workforce, which is really an interesting idea. It'd be interesting to hear some more clarity on that. Another cluster of ideas came around the idea of wages, so improving wages for food system workers who might be working on local farms. That was one of the ideas suggested by steering policy committee members. We also have land protection and development restrictions on this. I'm sorry, I'm just checking the chat and noticing that you all are still seeing the infrastructure one, and that is correct. That's what you're seeing on Menti, but you can go ahead and kind of minimize that for now. And we're just kind of looking at the Google Doc that I'm sharing via the Zoom. So can everybody see the Zoom? Can everybody see the Zoom, the Google document that I'm sharing here? Yes. Okay, in Zoom, not seeing Google Doc, huh? So I'm screen sharing, and I believe I'm sharing this, so we've got some people who are seeing it, but not everybody. So yes, when you're looking at infrastructure, that is the Menti screen. So we don't want to look at that. You guys can go ahead and actually close that. We have gotten all the submissions that we're going to be able to do from that. So here, my point is for us to take a look at the Google Doc that I am screen sharing via Zoom, and we'll kind of walk through this. Some people are saying that the screen is Menti. And
you have to scroll. I think you just need to scroll. Your Google Doc is up, but it's on infrastructure. That's what we see there.
That's interesting. So when I am looking at it, I'm seeing local farms, but I think that it might be because we have folks working down in the infrastructure part of it.
Yeah.
Let me.
I'm gonna mute myself.
Yeah. Give me just a second, and we'll make sure we've got this done correctly. Okay, so the only thing I've got up here now is the Google Doc. There we go. And we will share the screen again. All right, and so now, does everybody see local farms in the Google Doc? There we go. Yes. Excellent. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. So let me kind of, now that we're all actually seeing the right thing that we want to, and thank you all for being flexible with us as we kind of work to make this as useful as possible for everybody. I'm going to very quickly walk us through some of the clusters ideas that we have here, and then open this up to conversation amongst you all if we have any questions about what particular policies mean, so that we can kind of better understand them before we kind of try to prioritize and figure out which ones are the most crucial. There's so many ideas here. It's a fantastic problem to have. It's a very comprehensive list. We'll just want to make sure that we have understanding on exactly what we mean by these so we can all make a really good decision about prioritizing them. So under the local farms policy priority, we had a lot of different policies that were suggested related to land transfer, access, and ownership. So transferring land to beginning farmers through land trusts, other methods of transitioning ownership, and monetary assistance for doing some of these things within family farms. Some ideas about wages, some ideas about land protection and development restrictions, so protecting soil and restricting non-agricultural uses. Also, under this local family or under local farms, offering health insurance options to farmers. and then a number of subsidies and tax and incentives kind of policies. So making it possible for diverse local farms to receive subsidies. So it's possible, I think, that maybe we could use a little bit more clarification on exactly what you mean by that. Also a good suggestion on tax easements for mid-sized working farms to help farmers move to full-time. Creating rewards programs to identify local farms that support farm to school. Incentives for a number of other things like small farms joining together at markets and stores, incentives like CAUV in support of more sustainable and regenerative farming practices. So it'd be interesting to talk a little bit, if anybody has any further ideas about what those incentives might be, that would be really, really useful to discuss. Then we also have zoning actions and regulation, farm labor, and education. So we have a number of different ideas, and then a few kind of like other suggestions on other things on sustainability, creating a higher ed review process, some specific suggestions for the Ohio Online EBT program. So a lot of ideas like this that probably don't necessarily fit only under local farms or just need a little bit further more clarification. So now that we've kind of walked through this, and we're going to try to do this up until about 3:50. So we've got just about 30 minutes left. And what we're going to try to do is spend a few minutes walking through this one and answering some questions about these. So how we'll do this is I'm going to pull up the Q&A here so I can see this. Yes, this document will definitely be shared afterwards, where we'll clean it up a little bit once we make sure that we have a really inclusive list of everything that was submitted in Menti, and with any additional detail that we add here in the discussion section. So here's a question for our policy ideas. Just to kind of get us started, and go ahead and answer these in the Q&A function, and you can upvote others' answers if you'd like to. But so do these clusters basically make sense? It looks like the things that we would do to support local farms is a really, really broad bucket. So we have everything from land transfer to all the different clusters that we shared with everybody. Did these seem to make sense? Do we think that there's anything missing from these clusters? Is there anything else that we need to add in here? We have a suggestion about a more collective model re-land ownership. So I think that when we get into the land ownership section, there's a number of different models, and we can kind of discuss those. So why don't we actually go ahead and start with those? So as far as the land transfer access and ownership cluster, we have a number of different ideas for these, about incentivizing the transfer of farmland to the next generation of farmers, to beginning farmers, and making particular efforts towards BIPOC farmers. So how would, do you all have ideas about the kind of incentives that would be useful to do this? If you have those kind of ideas, go ahead and you can raise your hand if you'd like to answer this question, if you have particular thoughts on it, and Amanda will go ahead and make you live so that you can do that. You're also welcome to just enter a comment through the Q&A button. Anybody, do we have any raised hands for folks who want to discuss some of the particular models that might be useful for incentives or for land transfer? I'm just paging through the different photos of everybody here and seeing if I see any raised hands. Amanda, do we have anybody, or?
No, we had one, but I gave them permission to talk and they didn't chime in, so it might have been old.
Okay, got it. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something. All right. Does anybody have any particular, so this is something that where it looks like we possibly need more research to figure out what maybe are the most effective methods for transferring farmland to next generation farmers. But some of the suggestions in here are really, really strong ones. Things like agrarian land trusts, grants for young farmers, land trust models being implemented for affordable housing, and if that could be applied to farmland. Can those of you who are looking through these different ideas for land transfer and access and ownership, if any of these ideas seem particularly strong to you, if you'd like to go ahead and enter that in the Q&A function, that would be really helpful for our steering committee going forward to kind of figure out where to focus their research on exactly what kinds of policy, or where to focus their research. So take a look at the different ideas that are listed here. And if you have any thoughts on what would be most important, go ahead and enter those and or upvote anyone else's. And in the meantime, I will move on to the next one. So one of the other suggestions we have here are wages to improve food system workers, giving them a same minimum wage as tipped employees. That was the only one that kind of directly had to do with wages, as far as I can see, which is interesting. Our next one is land protection and development restrictions. So we only really have one of these development restrictions on here, although I do think that when we get down into zoning and regulation, there's some kind of similar items that are being suggested there. So take a look through these. And, oh, thank you, Julia Lynn. Julia Lynn's just entered a question into the Q&A about the kind of access and ownership model she thought would be useful. So that's a really, really great way to enter feedback on what we're talking about. But overall, so what I'm seeing here is a really, really broad list of different ideas for this. Everything from land protection and the subsidies and tax incentives that would go to make that happen. When it comes to the kind of incentivizations for family farms or small farms for things like this, if anybody has any particular ideas about the kinds of incentives that would be useful, please go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to discuss that, or enter your comment into the Q&A. And Ken's noting that, yes, we could use some editing to trim these lists down quite a bit. What we're going to try to be doing after this is to consolidate questions or consolidate policies that seem like they're pretty similar and could be combined, and try to get to a more manageable list. And the plan is definitely to share that back out, not only with everyone who was so helpful in generating them during this session right here, but also afterwards to folks who couldn't make the summit, but may also want to be involved and engaged on making a decision on this. I'll scroll us down a little bit further and try to get us through land use so we can get into some of the other ones, but it looks like some of the regulation things, some of the regulation ones might also be related to the incentives and rewards as well. So what we're going to do is try to work to, if you all see things in there that you think it would make sense to consolidate, please go ahead and note that. And if anybody would like to discuss anything that they have a question about, make sure that they understand what they think is being meant by the person who submitted it. Please feel free to raise your hand, and Amanda will give you voice capability. All right, we have a few other suggestions that are not necessarily policy items, but they definitely could be helpful in getting further discussion. We will skip those for now, just to kind of try to stay on track and move into access and education. So here it looks like we have a number of clusters as well. So the first one looks like centers on SNAP and EBT. This is a huge area, one of the main channels for access, of course. And so we have a number of policies that are about incentivizing the development of an online physical infrastructure, making sure that smaller retailers are able to adopt the same kind of SNAP EBT technology, simplifying the process to include local farms. And so, yeah, it looks like this ensuring online EBT can be used by venues other than Walmart and Amazon would be similar to the smaller retail. So it looks like there's some opportunities to kind of consolidate some of those after this. Let me see about one of the new questions we've had in there. And so if you all have thoughts about the ones that are that could be consolidated, or anything here in the incentivization, any specifics about what kinds of incentivization you're talking about, that would be very helpful. And you can either submit those via text, or you can raise your hand to speak if you would like to. There, all the education. Yes, Julia Lynn, good question, suggestion about the education, and some good notes on zoning, regulation, and incentives. Planning consultants that understand. So that's a good note also, Brian. So we need planning consultants that don't specialize only in urban planning, but also in agricultural strategies. All right. In addition to the access and education, so obviously access, SNAP, and EBT are a huge part of it, but schools are another main channel for this. So we've got a couple of different ideas here. The Nutrition Educational Pilot Program.
Amy, I did just give somebody permission to speak. So
oh, great.
Somebody raised their hand.
Great. Please go ahead.
Hey, Amy, it's Paul Dorns from Pastured Providence down in Southern Ohio.
Hi.
Hi. I was just had a couple of notes that back on the incentive conversation. I've worked with a couple people moving this idea forward, but it is very difficult because when you have incentive, you almost have to at some level imply that a certain practice is better than another in order to say that we agree that this is worth putting more money or thought into. And that tends to be, at least from what I've seen, where things sort of get stalled or shanghaied, is because everybody's version of positive or beneficial or the right answer can be really different. But that being said, like once you get past that thought process and agree somehow on a level or practice that is beneficial, for example, rotational grazing as it pertains to animal-based agriculture, climate issues associated with carbon sequestration. Those kinds of things are ideas that come to my head as a pastured livestock guy. But once you decide what might be beneficial, some ideas for rewarding and incentivizing could be everything from favorable lending rates, with whether you're talking about a financing model or a CDFA or TIF. Perhaps even within the existing government systems, Farm Service Agency's microloan program could be in, they do that for other types of things and different types of people. So why not for different types of practices as well? Even taking that a step further into the USDA side of things, where grant opportunities, whether it's value add producer grant, REAP, EQIP, those kinds of things, are all opportunities to give a nod towards a specific type of practice in order to incentivize it and reward good behavior, for lack of a better word.
Thank you so much, Paul. That's super, super helpful. So am I understanding what you're saying is with the idea of incentivizing to kind of keep the opportunities within the kind of the focus of local farms and things that improve healthy, locally owned and locally focused and ecologically sound and resilient local farms, a broad category of the kind of things that you would try to incentivize, and then a number of, and then you name some specific strategies that could be attractive and helpful to different kinds of producers within them. Am I understanding you properly?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So kind of a two-step process in my mind, where there's anecdotal evidence, there's studies that have done on single farm or even regionally speaking, but nothing that there's still this sort of idea of building a volume of studies and research that prove For example, the ecological and climatic benefits of rotational grazing, or localized processing versus the large scale industrial food, specifically meat production model. When you compare those two, ecologically, humane treatment of animals, all of the things kind of surface of, hey, this is a really good idea compared to what we do now to produce just a ton of really cheap, crappy meat. So I think that's the first step in pushing that forward, is to go recognize, find those gaps, and then get a proof of concept forward. And then you can take that and say, hey, this is real, this is proven, the benefits that is, and then you can talk to folks at an FSA, USDA, ODA, the financing folks, and say, this is what we have proven now is good for us, for the environment, for human health, for animal health, and then set up the reward system or incentivized system in whatever that might look like.
Thank you, Paul. That's a really excellent suggestion. Our steering committee members who were listening in on this part of it, did you have any further questions about? I think what Paul's proposed there is almost kind of a strategy for incentivizing a wide range of different behaviors, and not just some of the specifics ones that were mentioned in the generation that people did. So we'll get ready to go ahead and move on to other ones, to the rest of our policy buckets here. We're going to finish up the access and education one, and then move on to infrastructure institutions here in just a couple of minutes. But steering committee members, any questions from you on anything we've talked about so far?
Amy, I did want to mention that there's one attendee with their hand raised, Heather, and she does have permission to talk.
Great, go for it.
Can you guys hear me?
Sure can.
All right, super. I just wanted to sort of reiterate what Paul was commenting on, in that the Sustainable Agriculture Research Education Unit is an excellent, has some really excellent models for that type of research. SARE offers dollars each year to farmers to be able to do some of that critical research. And so I think that there's an opportunity to kind of look or partner or see those models in action through the Sustainable Ag Research and Education component of that. So I just wanted to make sure that folks are aware of that. And I know that Paul probably most likely is, but it's it's an opportunity to start to identify some of those key steps, right, to moving towards a more regenerative type of agriculture.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you.
Just in the interest of keeping us moving through the huge gold mine of suggestions you all have submitted, I'm going to move us into the next cluster within the Access and Ed, grocery stores. So a number of different ideas here for different kinds of grocery stores, infill, food deserts. A lot of these look the same, and again, we have statewide incentives for the development of this. We also have local food reimbursement funding and purchasing incentives. So local food purchasing, so extend through rulemaking and additional food purchasing to pasture meat. So we're talking about some of the areas to extend things to, and kind of other reimbursements to organizations who would purchase local foods. I think, if I'm understanding from the suggestion from Mr. or Ms. Oppenheim. Any comments on this one, or does everybody understand what is being meant by the 10-cent reimbursement? All right, if anybody wants to jump in on anything in grocery stores or local food reimbursement, go ahead and you can either raise your hand, and Amanda will let me know when somebody has and what needs to speak. And then otherwise I'll go on to our other ones. So it looks like we have public statewide coordination, which sounds like a really good idea that would support a number of these different things. Incentives for school field trips to farms, use of state-owned assets for K-12 agriculture and food education initiatives, And then I'm going to the equity issues. So we'll be looking at every single one of the policy priorities that are identified. Once we are able to narrow down from this and get to a list of kind of the most key ones to start with, we'll be looking at how all of those are implemented through an equity lens that will cover not only gender, but also race and ethnicity and orientation as well. And then transportation, incentivizing public transportation units to work with communities and develop food routes. So actually, I'm going to argue that transportation, that this one actually might belong in infrastructure as well. But so this is something that we can kind of clean up as we go forward. Again, so if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to raise your hand or enter those in the Q&A. You can upvote anyone else that anyone else has spoken already there as well. And then we have a number of programming ideas. And I know that there are lots of people who are doing some of this programming work as well. So it's not surprising that people have a lot of ideas about what this should look like. In the meantime, though, we're at 3:40, so I'm going to move us on to infrastructure. So the themes that we have showing up in here: public statewide coordination. So this is one of the sample policies that was created, creating a task force at the Ohio Development Services Agency that could coordinate as necessary to identify regions and types of food infrastructure, and then to develop aggregation, distribution, and processing networks to connect producers and utilizers. So public statewide coordination within government looks to be one. Public financing tools and strategies. A really interesting suggestion, a couple of them for green banks. So it looks like we can consolidate those into one going forward. Prioritizing sustainable local food and farm businesses with favorable lending rates. So again, that incentives bucket seems to be one that is kind of reaching across all of these rather than being a subset of each one of the different priority areas. And advocate at ODA and State House to support Aggie bonds in Ohio. So a number of different financial strategies in here. So we're looking at a bunch of different financing tools. And then another part of infrastructure would be local food hubs. Lots of different ideas about assets that could be usefully shared and bottlenecks that could be eliminated here. And then local processing infrastructure. So seems like some of that would be similar to the idea of local food hubs, like you could accomplish some of that processing within those. But some really good, I love some of these very specific suggestions about mobile processing options for meat and non-meat items, and some very specific ones that I think are really show how on the ground and in the trenches you all are working on this. So really, really helpful there. And then some zoning changes as well, which would help to make it possible for us to do some of the things that are necessary to have local food hubs and things. And then, wow, you guys submitted so many things. Market connections and building new markets. Incentivizing climate and health-friendly businesses, workforce training, tax incentives, local food procurement, local support for food councils. So I'm wondering if folks think that there might, do any of you all who are out there looking down at all these different themes and clusters that have been generated by everybody, do you all see ways that these, that some of these kind of work together? It kind of occurs to me that, you know, some of the incentivization stuff works as its own kind of first primary policy. But then there's also incentivizing things here within the particular infrastructure bucket. And then the idea of, I think you could combine some of the local food hubs, the local processing infrastructure, and local food procurement and food councils. Seems like a lot of these might go together. Does that seem right to folks? Does anybody have any thoughts on any of these? I'm going to go ahead and check the Q&A. If anybody has any more thoughts on some of these that could kind of go together, or if there's any kind of specific questions that you have about any of these, or any that you disagree with, that you see might be in tension with any of the other items that we've talked about earlier, please feel free to raise your hand and we would love to discuss those as a group. I will move us on to our last bucket of institutions. So let's just take a scroll down through here and see how much we're trying to cover with institutions here. It is a lot. So here in this one, so again, we're seeing local food purchasing policies. So institutional utilization and participation in the food system, changing to state contracting and procurement rules. It looks to me like a lot of these are going to go alongside of the infrastructure, or go alongside the incentivization and the local food hubs and things that we were talking about in the infrastructure as well, which makes sense because the major nodes in a network that has good infrastructure are of course these institutions. So I think we're gonna, we'll just kind of allow everybody to review these and ask any questions you might have about these, raise any concerns or anticipate any problems or anything that we might have with any of these. Developing incentives for large institutions to increase their local purchasing. So a number of things on this. If anybody has any ideas about specific incentives from your perspective that would be most useful, we've talked about the fact that there are a number of them, everything from micro lending and things like that for family farms. Are those the same for institutions, or are they different? Let's see. Food procurement. So we have someone who mentions a really important note, which is that food procurement for schools is regulated by the USDA, not locally. That's a really important point to think about as you strategize where to try to make these, where to do this advocacy. So I'll go on and keep us moving through the rest of our themes here. We also have focusing on higher ed and K-12, so education systems. So taking advantage of the opportunity we have to reach our young people and let them know about local food, and making the institutions, which are obviously also often huge employers and have huge community impact through their buying power, also more prone to doing local food purchasing. Labor. So a number of different labor options there. And these are for labor within institutions. So this is a little bit separate from the local farms one. So that these are interesting as well. Incentives, again, we see a bunch of these. Carbon credits. I think that this might have been the first time we've seen, oh no, I think we've mentioned some other ecological things, but carbon credits from farmers using regenerative practices. I think that this one, yeah, so connecting businesses to local farms in this way. Incentivizing hospitals and other public health organizations, perhaps, to support community health through local farms. As recognizing institutions that do this. Percentage off groceries for purchasing ugly produce. We've probably all seen a lot of the organizations that specialize in only providing ugly produce, but making it possible to do that within other institutions as well. Yes. All right, just trying to keep an eye on the chat there as well as the Q&A session. Again, we're just going to wrap up the reviewing session right here, but if anybody has any questions or comments they'd like to share, go ahead and raise your hand. And then lastly, some regulations. So promoting transparency in the food supply chain system. So if you have any specifics that you'd like to mention about where you think, who needs this transparency? Is it consumers, purchasers, both, where this might be implemented? This is something that obviously the steering committee can do further research on as they, once we know what the priorities are. But if anybody already, whoever submitted it already knows this and wants to share what that might look like, that'd be very helpful. And then lastly, in the equity section, we are looking at turning over prison, farmland, and meat processing infrastructures to BIPOC, which is a great, a really, really interesting idea. obviously there's a huge history of working with ex-offenders and other folks in the local food movement. So, and as I mentioned before, equity is something that we will absolutely be thinking about once we prioritize these as a way of operationalizing all of these. So, as a number of folks have mentioned, this is a huge amount of ideas. We didn't want to focus on limiting people to a certain number and trying to make it so that we could just get through a limited number of choices and prioritizing those and deciding to move on those. We really wanted to harness all the ideas that the network has so that you all really are bought into and we've garnered all the wisdom that you all who are in the trenches are absolutely sharing. But we do want to, so what the steering committee will be doing, and I'll turn this over to Amy in just a moment to kind of recap that, but we'll be organizing this in a more consolidated way and sharing it with, of course, everybody who was part of this generation process, but also the rest of the network as well, and encouraging folks to either potentially add more suggestions if they didn't have a chance to do so during this, but also to prioritize. And we'll be looking across all these 4 buckets and trying to choose a small, manageable number of items to focus on first. And so with that, I just want to thank you all again for all of your ideas and for bearing with us as we tried to make this transparent to everybody. Great job to Brian and Angela, who helped out getting everything out of the Menti back end and out here in a way that we could share it with everybody else. And thank you all for all your ideas. And I will turn this over to Amy to talk to us about the next steps that the steering committee will be taking based on this session.
Wow, thank you, Amy Lee, for leading us through that. As someone who also works in big sticky paper and whiteboards and Post-its and dots, the change to Menti and that technological solution to get us all to generate these ideas and work together is really impressive. So thank you for your agility and your flexibility, and a big thank you to Brian Estabrook and Angela Blatt for their behind the scenes hustle to invent a new way to organize these things on the fly as we were really coming up with all of these wonderful ideas. As has been said, the purpose of this meeting was for idea generation, and you all did exactly that. So wow, you hit it out of the park, and we're grateful for your energy and your participation. And it means we have a lot of good things to work with, and we know that we're stronger together with these ideas. It also means we have our work cut out for ourselves. As chair of the policy committee, I'm a little daunted by what's ahead on our plates as we work to both consolidate and organize and simplify and help prioritize all of these ideas into something a little bit more digestible. So stay tuned for information, again, electronic information, not in-person gathering. You'll see posts to our listserv. So if you haven't signed up for that, go to ohiofpn.org, and information will be coming forward before the end of the year about both a consolidated list, how you can continue to contribute to these ideas as we help to whittle them down and prioritize them into a very clear platform for the year ahead. Tomorrow, we come back to another Zoom meeting for a couple of hours. And this one will be similar in that we'll be talking about our policy work, but it will be very action-oriented. We'll get a training from legal expert Jen Povis on advocacy and lobbying 101, legal tips for 501c3s, nonprofit and advocates in coalition. So please come prepared with your policy ideas at the local level. I get scared if I see that sentence written. Y'all have no shortage of policy ideas, but we will have time to talk face-to-face in the breakout rooms about these specifics in these 4 areas. So some of that clarification and consolidation and prioritization might even begin to happen tomorrow. So I hope to see you back here, here in this virtual way for a continued conversation about the work we can do together. And I think that's it. I'm going to turn it back to Amy Lee for a close. And maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm the close. Thank you, everybody, for your time today. And that's, I think, it from us for today's version of the summit. Come back tomorrow. Bye.